My name is Kevin McCurry and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting. Especially, I think we've people who are here have braved both weather and party politics fatigue to come to hear someone speak about something, an issue which is very, very relevant to the democratic question. The meeting is organised by the Desmond Greaves Summer School Committee and the People's Movement.
Well, thanks very much, Nick, and thanks for Kevin, and thanks for coming out on a Saturday afternoon. Can everyone hear me? I speak fairly quietly.
Microphone.
Bring them.
And I would generously describe the weather as atrocious. And so thanks for coming out on a Saturday afternoon in atrocious weather. The book is 2 years, or nearly 2.5 years old now, and we're just working on the sequel. We've nearly finished the sequel. And we're extending the book. In that book, what we wanted to talk about was I'd become really interested, and by the way, I'm an economist, and I'm one of the founders of what now is called modern monetary theory, and I'll talk a little bit about that subsequently. But what was interesting to me as a person who was on the left of the political divide was how the hell did our political parties that were founded historically, say the Labor Party in Australia was the political voice of the trade union movement. And that was its rationale. It was to represent workers, not the trade unions were representing workers industrially, and the Labor Party was to represent the workers politically. And it had a common history with these sort of parties all around the world. And what I was amazed as we traversed history, and especially the last 3 decades, was how the hell did our political voices on the progressive side become neoliberals? And you can see that in all over the world, in the various Labor parties, the Democrats in America, the socialist parties, they've all become neoliberal by and large. And what I wanted to investigate with Thomas, who's an Italian journalist, was how did that happen and what can we do about it? And so we go back to what we call the turning points in history, and we start off, surprisingly, pre-Thatcher Britain, second Wilson government, where if you know your history, you'll know that in the annual Labor conference in Blackpool in 1976, James Callaghan declared that the age of Keynesianism was over, that the thought that governments could use their economic policy, fiscal policy, spending and taxation to improve employment and maintain and keep unemployment low was over. Those days were over. And that what governments now had to do was to maintain price stability. Now, those comments coincided with developments in the academy, which we call monetarism. Milton Friedman's Chicago gang, and Dennis Healey, the Chancellor at the time, had become infested with monetarism, and he had infested James Callaghan, and they were actually, they were up politically within their own party against Tony Benn, who wanted a completely different approach to resolve the sort of post-OPEC oil crisis stagnation that hit the whole world economies. So that's, most people think that Maggie Thatcher was the first neoliberal monetarist government. No, it was Harold Wilson. It was that era, the second Harold Wilson period. It was the Labor Party that did it. And then we look at 1983 with Francois Mitterrand, who'd been elected on a socialist agenda to reverse the vicissitudes of the Raymond Barre era in France in the late 70s. Raymond Barre imposed the first really organised austerity on a nation, allegedly to fight inflation, but the agenda was clear to sort out the trade unions, to sort out the control of workers in certain state industries and all of that stuff. Barr failed dramatically, of course. The austerity didn't stop the inflation, but all it did was cause unemployment to rise to elevated levels and persist. And so he was chucked out and Mitterrand came in on a socialist agenda. And then by 1983 we had the famous austerity term, where Jacques Delors was his finance minister and he became obsessed with monetarism. And of course you know who Jacques Delors is. He's the architect of the Eurozone. And Mitterrand sold out. He turned his back on socialism and became a neoliberal effectively. And these are major turning points. And when you're talking to the left now, they say, oh yeah, but what about the Mitterrand? He was forced to do that. And what about James Callaghan? Well, he was forced to do that because he had to go to the IMF to borrow money. And of course, if you understand macroeconomics, you understand the first basic principle of a currency issuing government, like the British government in 1976, was that they can never run out of money. They issue the currency stupid. And so this was one of the first examples of what in the book we talk about depoliticisation, where elected governments want to do something nasty that they know is politically unpopular. So they depoliticise it by saying, oh, we've got to do this because the IMF told us to do that. The British government wasn't going to run out of money. They issued their own currency. It was a lie. The British people didn't know. They bought it. They thought it would run out of money. In actual fact, they never even borrowed the money. It was just a ruse. And so what we go then through a whole series of these turning points, and what we concluded was that by the early 70s, the left were getting completely beguiled by the so-called globalisation agenda. And the right were saying, oh, look, we've got international finance now, global capital is everywhere, and nation states are no longer, that's the democratically elected political bodies that we've relied on to do, help us improve our material standards of living, that those nation states are now powerless in the face of international capital. That was what was being told to the left in the early 70s. And I'd go to political economy conferences as a young postgraduate student, and I would be hearing papers by the left saying the nation state's finished, it can't resist the global capital, we've got to organise internationally, and all this stuff. Now, what the right understood, they duped the left into that narrative, and what the right understood very clearly was that if they wanted to run a right-wing agenda, a corporatist neoliberal agenda, the only way they could do it, short of getting an army and invading the joint, which is what they did in Iraq, but short of doing that, the way they have to do it is through the legislative and regulative power of the nation state. All of the major changes that we could talk about as neoliberal have occurred through the legislative processes of our nation states. And what neoliberalism isn't an abandonment of the nation state, it's a reconfiguration of the nation state to serve the interests in the glorious full employment era after the Second World War. Our states were like mediators in capital labour conflict, and they were essential for both labour and capital to develop their agendas. And in the neoliberal era, what we've observed is that the nation state has become an agent of capital. And all neoliberalism is it's a state program. And so what we argue in re-conceptualises is that the left has to recognise that. And it has to recognise that everything has to go through the legislative capacity of the state, and that the left has to reconfigure the state back, take control, reclaim it. Now then you come up against the elements on the left that have become obsessed with a whole range of issues and then immediately say identity issues. And then they immediately say, oh yeah, well, Mitchell and Fazi are advocating nationalism and xenophobia and all the rest of it. Well, no, not at all. What we're arguing, and this is, I'll come to the economics in a moment, what we're arguing is that currency sovereignty is everything. And that whatever the viable currency sovereign geographical space is, that's the legitimate state. And that what we've got to reclaim is currency sovereignty. We're not talking about patriotism or xenophobia or locking disadvantaged people out of our borders or anything like that. That's old stuff. Okay, so that was what the book was about. And that allowed us then to obviously comment on and develop an analysis of the European Union and the EMU and the surrender of currency sovereignty to the euro, which in your country you've had the misfortune to do. Okay, so that's the background. Now let's move on. What's going on after however many years you want, decades of neoliberalism? The consensus is starting to break down. And there's a major paradigm shift occurring in economics that is being driven by several forces, but it's breaking down the macroeconomic consensus of the mainstream. Now, talking about macroeconomics on a Saturday afternoon might be your idea of fun. It's my idea. I'll talk about it any time, including in my sleep problem. But if the left, the progressive left, are to have any hope of regaining control of their states and helping their states become international citizens, and that's a very important point because I'm emphasising, in this book we emphasise currency sovereignty and then internationalisation, not this idea that you've got to abandon nation states and create world states. That's pie in the sky stuff. And if the left is to become a force again, then we have to understand economics. We have to become educated in what currency sovereignty means, what capacities that gives the nation state, and what capacities and what are the consequences of surrendering that. Because otherwise you're always just going to be ruled out of the debate by economists who claim authority, intellectual authority, that you guys don't know what you guys, being generic, you guys don't know what you're talking about. So the left has to, my role as an economist, a progressive economist, is that I think we've got to educate ourselves about economics, and that's my mission. So, I travel around a lot talking about economics. And it might sound dry, but you don't get to first base unless you can contest these basic economic myths, this fictional world that my mainstream colleagues have created. Yeah, if you're not in that game, you're not in the game at all. And so there's this paradigm shift underway, and you can see it occurring in a number of different ways. The first way is there's an anti-establishment revolt going on among ordinary citizens. And this is because if we did a report card, when you go to school at the end of each year, you get a report card. And if it's bad, you hide it from your parents. I did often. Bill was a bad boy, anti-authority, all that stuff. But if we did a neoliberal report card, it'd be a crisis report card. We've got precarious work, we've got rising underemployment, we've got increasing poverty levels, we've got communities breaking down, we've got public services being degraded. I was in Rome last weekend giving a talk to the Senate, and what you learn is that all these bridges are now being closed by the government because they're dangerous for trucks to traverse. public infrastructure is breaking down all throughout the world, but particularly in the Eurozone countries. And we've got deteriorating public services. Healthcare's deteriorating, public education's deteriorating. And we've got a climate disaster on our hands. There's pictures the other day of Antarctica, the West Antarctica is breaking off. These things are, and in Australia we've got massive bushfires destroying huge swathes of our forests. And in my lifetime we've never had that type of disaster. It doesn't rain much in Australia anymore. And in Helsinki, I go there every February. I've never been in there in February without snow. There's no snow there now. And these things are all interrelated. And the social disaster that neoliberalism has created is married and directly related to the climate disaster that it's created. That's the report card. And that disaster has been created by governments following the advice of my profession, following the advice of mainstream economists. And what they've created is such a dystopia that there's now an anti-establishment revolt going on among citizens all around the world. People may not understand the driving factors, they just know that something's wrong and they're pissed off about it. So you've got the yellow vests in France. You've got people marching in the streets. You've got Brexit choice, and I'll come back to that later. You've got Donald Trump. You've now got the reality that Sanders will be up against Trump, both of whom are representing traditional political forces, but they're the anathema of the machines of those political forces. The actual mainstream machines of both of the Republicans and Democrats hate the idea of Trump and Sanders contesting the presidency. That's an anti-part of this revolt. And you've got all around the world the traditional progressive political voices in decline. And I won't comment too much on your election, I don't understand it fully, but that's an example of this. But all through Europe, you've got socialist parties just disappearing. Why? Because they're now being identified as being vehicles of neoliberalism. Why? Because they have supported neoliberal macroeconomic policies that are inflicting this crisis on our societies. You've got the great British Labour Party decimated in an election in December against one of the worst Conservative governments in history. Yet you've got former Labor voters voting for the Tories that have killed their libraries, cut their local government services, ruining their national health system. You've got Labor voters voting for the people who did that because their own party is so moribund. That's the anti-establishment revolt. People are working out that the economics of our societies aren't delivering. They don't quite understand it, but they're rebelling against it in all various ways. The second part of the paradigm shift is coming from another quarter, and this is the policy dissonance. And what I mean by that is that policymakers around the world are working out that the way of managing economic policy isn't working. And so you've got the neoliberal period has been characterised by a promotion of monetary policy, that is setting interest rates by central banks, to the priority to maintain macroeconomic policy. And fiscal policy has been demoted to being just an austerity vehicle. And that was always just an ideological choice. And that was part of this depoliticisation I talk about, because elected ministers could say, oh, the central bank, that's independent, that's they're just doing that, we've got no control over that. Liars, they have. But that's part of this story of externalising the havoc so that they don't wear the political damage. And what we've seen is that shift in aggregate policy, because during the post-war period, up until the sort of monetarist revolution, fiscal policy was dominant. And it made sense. It's a direct intervention, spending and tax intervention. That was all eschewed because they didn't want governments being active in the economy. They wanted to minimise the intervention of governments and keep government spending to bail their mates out when they make too many mistakes in the financial sector. But not pay for good pensions or hospitals or schools. That had to be stopped. Now, after 3 or 4 decades, depending which country you're from, what we're now observing is that the monetary policy parameters are being pushed to ridiculous levels. You've now got negative interest rates all around the world. You've got financial markets lending to governments long-term, 10, 15, 20 years, at negative yields, that is, paying governments to lend them money. And that's the third point I'll make in a moment. And yet now you've got central bankers finally realising that can't go on, that's ridiculous. You've got central banks all around the world trying to stimulate inflation, for God's sake, because we've scorched the earth so much, there's deflationary forces. And they've been building up there. I could show you beautiful graphs of the asset side of their balance sheets out of huge expansion as they've been buying government debt through QE and those sort of programs, quantitative easing. All in the name of producing inflation. How did they get that idea? From mainstream economists, and they haven't been able to do it. And finally some of them are coming out, and good on them, and admitting that this can't go on. And in Australia, for example, the Reserve Bank governor has been begging the Treasurer to stop this. The Australian economy is slowing down dramatically at the moment because of too much household debt and governments pursuing fiscal austerity. And the central bank governor has been begging the Treasurer to increase a fiscal stimulus. And so you've got the anti-establishment result, that's just grassroots action. Then you've got these key monetary policy people. Mario Draghi was begging the EU to think about a fiscal stimulus, and that's happening all around the world. The third reason for this paradigm shift going on is coming from the financial markets. And increasingly I'm getting invited to talk to the top end of town, as we say in Australia. These are the big bond traders, the big investment banks, the big pension and insurance funds. And they're desperate to know about modern monetary theory, which is sort of now the flavour of the month, as I'll come back to, because they are realising that they've been completely dudded by my profession. They're losing money now. Their position is becoming precarious. Here's two ways. The first way is during the global financial crisis, my profession predicted, because of the rising deficits and the rising public debt, that increased yields would occur as bond markets would force governments to pay higher yields to compensate for the increased risk of insolvency, and that the higher debt and the QE that was going along with that would also drive up inflation. So, believing my profession, the financial market, what would you do in that case? Well, if bond yields are going up, that means bond prices are going to fall, and if you take positions in bonds, you may well have capital losses because the prices will fall. So you've got to get out of bonds. And if inflation's likely to rise because of the QE, this is what my profession predicted, then what's the best portfolio choices to be in with high inflation? Real assets like real estate, because they protect you against rising inflation. So all of these big investment banks, etc., took advice from my profession, and that's how they manage their portfolios. And as you know, as I know, yields have been falling ever since. They're now negative in many cases across the so-called yield curve, across different maturities of government bonds. Yields are negative. Bond prices have gone up. If they had have gone long in bonds, they would have made a killing. And of course, real assets moving your portfolio into real assets, predicting inflation, what's happened? We've been fighting deflation. So they've lost money, and they're starting to work that out. And the other really more serious thing, which will affect us, is that when you talk to these characters, you work out that there's what's called a maturity mismatch going on in the big insurance and pension funds. What does that mean? That's jargon. What does it mean? Well, if you take one of those type of funds, they've got long-term cash liabilities that they're contractually forced to meet. You know, like a pension fund, they're paying out superannuation payments, or an insurance fund that's got annuity expectations that they're going to have to pay out each month a certain amount of cash. That's their liability side of their balance sheet. Now, so their asset side, that's their investments, has to provide cash flow that's commensurate and timed to meet those liability payments. Now, what's happening is with all the negative interest rates everywhere, their asset sides are not able to produce that. With the fiscal austerity, their business model historically has been worked on leveraging off public infrastructure projects. That gives them investment opportunities to fund big road projects and public transport projects and public hospitals and all of those things. Now, with the austerity cutting all that out and then monetary policy being pushed to extremes so there's negative interest rates, their asset structures are not delivering commensurate returns. And so there's this maturity mismatch between their long-term liabilities and their short-term asset returns. So what are they doing? Well, to stay solvent, they're shifting their asset portfolios into increasingly risky positions. Because the more risky your assets are, the higher the return. And what does that mean? That means that they're on the brink of insolvency if there's just small changes in environmental conditions. And the big investment funds are now freaking out. That's staring them in the face now. And so what are they doing? They're becoming agents for progressive demands for fiscal policy, because they want governments to stop this monetary policy bias and to stop the austerity bias and to start investing in large-scale public infrastructure, both to reverse the degradation that the austerity has caused, but also, they're not great citizens, they're wanting returns, safe investment opportunities. So you've got all these disparate forces that normally wouldn't be pursuing the same agenda, pursuing a major shift in the way we think about economic policy. And what they're all working out in different ways with different levels of comprehension is that the mainstream economics profession has not delivered anything that's sustainable for their particular activities, has undermined our material welfare, and can't even explain the way the world operates. And what they've worked out is that the rantings of mainstream economists have created a fictional world that has no applicability to the real world. And so there's a paradigm shift occurring. Now, what's happening? Well, keep hitting. It's just wrongly situated. So you'd think, okay, that's a great opportunity for progressives. But the problem is that as the world got the humanities and social sciences in the 70s got obsessed with postmodernism and deconstruction and all of that stuff that just sent everybody down a rabbit hole, the heterodox economists and heterodox thinkers in economics got obsessed with identity. Now, I don't want anyone to leave the room and say that Bill Mitchell thinks that studies of feminism and ethnicity and sexuality are unimportant and not part of a progressive agenda. If you said that, you'd be wrong and I'd be really upset. They're really important things to study and to understand and integrate into a economic class narrative. But the problem is that retreat into that sort of postmodernist research agenda left the macroeconomic debate uncontested. And where the progressives did make comments on macroeconomics, they bought that early 70s line that there is no alternative. And so you got, the British Labour Party went into the British election in December with a neoliberal fiscal policy, more or less. And that's where my work has come to fore. I think if you do a Google search, you'll see, if you type in MMT, modern monetary theory, Google Trends has gone crazy. And that's because for the first time, there's now a challenger to the mainstream, directly one-to-one in macroeconomics. We're not getting sidetracked into any issues. We're looking at interest rate determination, effects of fiscal policy, effects of monetary policy, how banks work, how central banks work, how taxation works. So all the main issues, there's now a contest. All right. And what MMT tells us is what the capacities of a currency issuing government are. So not Ireland, you use a foreign currency, but almost every other state uses their own currency. And I'm not here to tell you all about MMT today, but what you understand for a currency issuing government, like Australia, like the US, like Britain, like Japan, any of these other countries, is that the government can buy whatever is for sale in that currency, including all idle labour, anytime it wants. And what that means is that there is no financial constraint on those currency issuing governments. And what that means is that we've been led to believe that a government is like a household, and that our experiences as households gives us some knowledge of government finances. Now, as households, we're financially constrained because we use the currency that the government issues. So we have to go to work to get income before we can spend. We have to use prior savings. We have to sell assets if we want to get money, or we have to borrow if we want to spend more than those sources of income. We're a currency user. A currency issuer is not constrained financially. Whereas mainstream economics has been telling you that the government has to tax in order to spend. False. Absolutely false. In actual fact, the government has to spend before we can get their currency and pay taxes in a logical way. And they say the government's got to borrow if it wants to spend more than taxes. False. It would never has to borrow in order to spend beyond its tax revenue. And what MMT teaches you is that what constrains government spending in the economy is not financial matters, but the real resources that it can buy. And so take two situations. Real resources are labour and capital and the things that the non-government sector owns that the government needs to access to run a government program, to transfer from the non-government sector into the government sector. And so take two situations where there's mass unemployment. Well, in that case, the government has no financial constraints clearly, and has no real constraints either, because it can buy all of that idle labour and bring it into productive use any time it chooses. So we know that when there's mass unemployment, it's a political choice. It's not a financial problem. And so when governments get up there and say we can't afford to do this, they're lying. And so if everybody gets an MMT understanding, they know that it will force the politicians to really flush out the ideology. Because I don't ever believe a politician who's in a currency issuing government who says we haven't got enough money. That's a lie, I know that. So you examine their real motives for having mass unemployment. Now take a different situation, rare in this era, where you have full employment. In other words, all the productive resources are currently being used in their current configuration. In that case, if the government wants to expand its use of those resources, say it gets a political agenda, it gets voted in to expand public health or something like that, and all the current resources in the nation are being fully used, well then it's got a problem, because it doesn't have a financial constraint. It can buy those resources, no problem. But if it does that, it will cause inflation, because it would be competing for the use with existing users. So what does it have to do in that? In other words, it's got a real resource constraint. And so what does it have to do in that context? What it has to do is deprive the existing users of the use. How might it do that? It has to reduce the existing users' purchasing power, because we're using those resources. How might it reduce our purchasing power? Taxing us. And so taxes aren't funding the spending. They're depriving us of using real resources so that the government can use them without causing inflation. It's a fundamental mind reset if you think about it. Now, there's lots more to do with MMT, but I want to move on and talk more political things now. And so what MMT tells you is what the currency capacity of the currency issuer are, but it also tells us, gives us a framework for understanding what the consequences of not having your own currency are. And so, what were the consequences of the 19 member states surrendering their own currency? Now, if you go back to the history of European integration, and the book I wrote before that one in 2015 was called Eurozone Dystopia, Groupthink and Denial on a Grand Scale. That was the title, published by Edward Elder. And that was my very exhaustive historical analysis of the process of integration as an ideological exercise from 1948 onwards. And what you learn from the history is that, you know, a lot of people think that the Germans drove the creation of the Eurozone. It was actually the French. Because going right back after the Second World War, Charles de Gaulle thought that European integration would be a way of reasserting France's domination in Europe. France had been completely destroyed during the Second World War, of course, and de Gaulle knew that Germany was in shame and wouldn't say much. That was his sense. And so France thought that they could push Europe as a project to assert their own control. And Jean Monnet and Robert Schuman also wanted to stop Germany misbehaving, because, you know, you go back to 1871 with Bismarck and then on and on. Germany had showed a proclivity to be martial and misbehave within Europe and not be a very good citizen. So they wanted to have this political project to assert France's domination in the post-war period, but also to keep Germany under control. And the very first thing they did, of course, was the Common Agricultural Policy, and that was a French plan to get subsidies from Germany to subsidise French farmers. That's what it was driving. That's what drove the Common Agricultural Policy. And Germany went along with that because they wanted to be European citizens after being misbehaving, but they also wanted to expand their markets for their burgeoning, their increasing industrial empire. And so integration was driven by those sort of things initially. And so then they had a sequence of studies, starting with the Basel Accord in 1969, where they set up the Wynne Commission to study how they could integrate and become a federal system with a common currency. Pierre Wynne's report in 1970 concluded, in short, and that committee studied effective federations like Australia and Canada and America. And what they concluded was that to become a successful monetary union, you would have to have a centralised fiscal authority, like a Ministry of Finance, with its own currency, and it would have to be politically legitimised by setting it up and embedding it within a European parliamentary system, like the Australian federal government, for example. And Wynne concluded that that would be very difficult in the context of European culture and history. And that report disappeared. The French and the Germans wouldn't agree to it. Germany wouldn't agree to a federal fiscal function, and France wouldn't agree to some of the other things. Then 1977 was the McDougall report. Same deal. They went and studied the federations because this integration agenda was always being pushed. And the McDougall report went further. They concluded the same thing. You had to have a federal fiscal function. You had to have that embedded in a political institution like a parliament, a federal parliament. And they concluded that they couldn't see that ever being possible within the reality of Europe and the member states. And there weren't 19 then, of course. But even within the smaller number, they believed that the cultural and the historical differences were too great, and the structures of the economies were too different in terms of their trading strengths to share a currency in a prosperous way. Now, what changed was that monetarism came along, and Jacques Delors, he was Minister of Finance in Mitterrand's government. Well, he then became European Commission boss, and then he became, he headed up his committee. And he was very crafty in forming his committee, because what he did was exclude all the finance ministers. They'd previously been on all of the other big studies of the possibilities of monetary union. And he knew all he had was central bankers and a couple of monetarist economists on his committee. And he knew that would create no nation fight out between the French and the Germans through the ministers of finance. And they could push through a neoliberal agenda. And they completely ignored the previous studies, McDougall and Wynne studies, that were very emphatic. And they came up with the EMU proposal, which went to Maastricht, which didn't have a federal fiscal function, didn't have that at all, left the fiscal authority at the member state level, but took their currency capacity off them. And so once you lose your currency, like Australia isn't financially constrained, our government, but once you take their currency off them, the nation state, they become immediately financially constrained. What does that mean? It means they have to raise taxes because they don't issue their currency anymore, and if they want to spend more than their currency taxes, they have to borrow. So they become susceptible to what we call default risk. And bond markets can then assess that the deficits are too high and they won't lend the money anymore. That's the consequences of not having your own currency. And of course there were all sorts of old Franco-German rivalries going into that Maastricht process. And the Germans, by the mid-90s, they were trying to work out all of the convergence and stuff, and the Germans didn't want Italy in it. You go through the documents, they didn't want Italy in it, and they tried to get Italy excluded from the stage 3 of the treaty process, which was the adoption of the currency, by appealing to its high public debt. If you remember, they had the series of convergence criteria that everyone had to meet before they could go to stage 3. And that was the beginning of the austerity. It wasn't the global financial crisis, it was the convergence period in the second half of the 90s. And of course it was pointed out to Theodor Weigel, who was the finance minister of Germany, that if they tried to exclude Italy on debt grounds, public debt ratios, above 60%, they'd have to exclude Belgium. And of course, politically, they couldn't exclude Belgium because, founding member of the community, and so they had to reluctantly accept Italy. So what then followed? Well, they'd left the fiscal authority back at the member states, refusing to have a federal capacity and a federal currency issuing capacity. And they then, all of the old enmities and distrusts then were expressed in the Stability and Growth Pact. The Germans didn't even want to call it SGP, they wanted to call it the Stability Pact. The first proposal from Weigel was a Stability Pact. It was the French that had to put in the growth because they knew they wouldn't be able to sell it to the French without some so-called optimism. Now, as it turns out, the Stability and Growth Pact is neither stability nor growth. The Stability and Growth Pact basically made it impossible for the member states who held the fiscal authority to defend their economies against the normal fluctuations and the abnormal fluctuations that occurred. Now, what happened in the crisis? Well, in the crisis, the deficits rose not because beyond the 3% threshold in the Stability and Growth Pact, not because the governments went on a discretionary stimulus, but because the so-called automatic stabilisers, which are inbuilt into fiscal policy, drove it. What does that mean? What it means is that when the fiscal outcome that we observe, the budget outcome you call it, we observe is a combination of both discretionary policy decisions, that's the budget statements, but also the state of the economic cycle. And so when an economic cycle turns down, the non-government spending cycle turns down, what happens? Spending falls, sales fall, unemployment rises, production falls, and tax revenue falls. And government spending on welfare rises. So even if the government doesn't do anything, their deficits will rise because of the fall in tax revenue and the rise in welfare spending, built into the parameters of the budget. And what we observed during the global financial crisis is just that cyclical effect, which was signalling how bad the economies were being hit by the non-government slowdown in spending because of the crisis. Just those cyclical effects drove the fiscal outcomes above the thresholds of the Stability and Growth Pact, which then triggered the mindless response by Brussels to impose austerity onto nations that were already floundering with non-government spending collapse. Now, anybody knows that responsible fiscal policy should be what we call counter-cyclical, the cycle being non-government spending cycle. And so responsible fiscal policy says if non-government spending cycle's going down, that means we're withdrawing our spending growth, then fiscal policy should counter that by increasing deficits to offset that spending loss so that we don't have recessions and we don't have rises in unemployment. And that when the non-government spending cycle is improving, the government can wind back a bit of that stimulus. Whereas in the Eurozone, which you're in, fiscal policy has been pro-cyclical. That has moved it moved in a same direction as the non-government spending cycle. In other words, when the non-government spending cycle went down, the government imposed austerity. It withdrew fiscal support for total spending. And that is, to anybody, any person with a reasonable understanding of macroeconomics, that's the exemplar of irresponsibility and it's devoid of any reason other than just pure ideology. Okay, a couple more minutes. So then we, that system is totally dysfunctional. And if you think back to 2010, the system would have collapsed then if the Europe, yeah.
Excuse me, sorry. Is there a microphone you could use?
Sure.
Thank you.
If you think back to 2010, the Eurozone would have collapsed because of that irresponsibility, unless the European Central Bank broke the law. Now, in May 2010, it brought in what was called the Securities Market Program. And that's when they started buying government debt under their so-called QE programs in the secondary bond markets. They've started to buy billions and then trillions of euro. And what were they doing? Well, they made some story that they were looking out for liquidity factors, and I won't go into what they are. That was just a ruse. What they were doing, in violation to the no bailout clause in the treaty, the ECB knew that they were the currency issuer, of course, in the Eurozone. They knew that if they didn't bail out the governments, then Italy, Spain, Portugal, probably Ireland would have gone broke around that time. So here you've got a system where the central bank, the principal macroeconomic institution in your architecture, is violating the law, even though the European Court of Justice claimed it didn't. That was just part of the whole denial of the groupthink of the Eurozone. So when the ECB did that, it was a recognition that the architecture was flawed and couldn't possibly survive. And they've spiked that, that program morphed into various different types of same sort of deal though. The ECB has been buying up government debt massively to save governments. Italy would have gone broke in June 2012 if the ECB hadn't bought masses of its debt. And so what you've got is a system. You're part of a system. And I won't go, if you remember all of the stuff in the 90s about the ratification process, and Denmark was the first nation to have a referendum. The citizens rejected it, and of course under the EU, if one nation rejects it, that's it. And so they had to do a quick deal, which allowed Denmark to be exempt from adopting the currency, and so they were able to just get across the line in the second referendum. Once France then went and stuffed up their referendum, quickly they abandoned the ratification. So you've all been bulldozed into a system that's undemocratic, that you mostly don't really understand the economics of, that you've got stacks of characters from my profession telling you complete lies about, yet that's the system that you've been bulldozed into. And then you talk to people and say, oh yeah, but there's no alternative. Well, of course there's an alternative. Dissolution's the alternative. And then we get to Brexit. And Brexit's part of this anti-establishment revolt that's going on. Maggie Thatcher did one good thing, only one, and that was to keep Britain out of the Eurozone. She understood currency sovereignty. She understood that if the Britain went in there, they'd be just like the rest of the Eurozone countries. Unable to look after their own people, unable to defend the economy against fluctuations, external fluctuations like the GFC. But the problem was that Britain became infested with austerity as well, totally unnecessarily, but as an ideological agenda. And that's the way we can think of Brexit, that it's a response to that neoliberal agenda. Now, just after the referendum, I had meetings with senior Labor officials, politicians and officials in London. And my argument to them then was that if you don't own Brexit, if you don't take the running and create a progressive Brexit narrative, then you're history. You'll be wiped out. And then I was told, oh yeah, but the majority of Labor voters are Remainers. And then I pointed out that the majority of your MPs are from Leave seats. And it's because of the peculiarities of the distribution of votes, You had this massive concentration of middle-class professional Labor voters in London and the college towns who were Remainers because they were doing okay by globalisation and EU. They were doing okay. And so that gave you a false impression of the Leave-Remain forces within the Labor vote. And you had all of these progressive economists supporting the Labor Party, and you know who they are, I won't name them publicly. But they were part of what we came to call Project Fear, pumping out these forecasts that if Britain left, there'd be devastation. I mean, the British Treasury said that within a very short time after the referendum, the British economy would collapse. And none of it's happened. And that's because these progressive forces had bought into the neoliberal narrative. And then they tell me, oh, we're cosmopolitans. And I say, yeah, cosmopolitanism, it ends at the Mediterranean. You don't care about people in Northern Africa who want to get into your so-called utopia. You let them die on beaches. And so Brexit's part of this paradigm shift. And the progressives have handed it over to the Tories because of all of this buy-in to neoliberalism in the Labor Party. They've had very poor advice and they've on economic matters, and they've really left the ground to the Tories. And now you're seeing them bitching about, and I'm not even sure you're allowed to say that anymore in this era of correctness, but I'm saying it. You've now got them saying, well, the Labor Party are going to have to oppose the deficits that the Tories are going to definitely increase as part of their so-called levelling out the Britain. So it's sort of, you couldn't make this stuff up. That Boris Johnson's probably going to be, and don't think that I'm a Tory at all. Not, I'd walk them off a short plank. But Boris Johnson's going to be smart enough to know that he wants to keep all of those Midlands and Northern constituencies Tory. And he knows full well that they've got currency sovereignty, and he knows that if he uses that sovereignty to improve public services and infrastructure, then that's going to be part of the story to stop them returning to Labor. And so you've got the Labor Party coming out and saying, oh gosh, there'll be higher deficits, we've got to attack them on that. That's a symbol of the way in which progressive politics has completely abandoned any tactical sense. And so what I urge progressive forces in the Eurozone to get over this idea that it's good to, you know, I've been in Europe for a couple of weeks now. Tomorrow I'm in Athens, Tuesday I'm in Paris. So I'm swanning around, and it's really great not to have all these currencies in my pocket. And the London left love going to the ski resorts in winter and not having to swap currencies when they go across borders. But look at the devastation that system's caused to humanity. Look at it can't possibly respond to climate emergency with national governments without their own currencies and bolted down by austerity rules. Can't possibly. The Eurozone is an economic corruption that biases societies to austerity permanently. You can't possibly get out of that. That's the consequences of not having your own currency. Sure, when the world trade is strong, you'll grow a bit. And then when the world trade slows down as zero, I mean, see figures for Germany yesterday, zero growth. Can't possibly deliver long-term sustainable prosperity. It can't possibly reduce inequality. It can't possibly maintain high levels of quality employment. And it can't possibly address the climate emergency. And like all currency unions that are built on false foundations, it will collapse. And when it collapses, it'll be more devastating than anything. And so I urge national governments, whenever I talk, I'm talking to the French Treasury on Tuesday, I'm talking to Greek officials on Monday, I urge them to work out a plan to unilaterally exit. And all of the stories, the scare stories you heard about Brexit that haven't come to fruition are the same sort of stories you hear about if you exit the euro. Devastation and all the rest of it. The reason why they don't want anyone to exit is because as soon as you get, if Greece had exited in 2012 and restored its own currency, it would have started growing immediately. Its unemployment rate would have fallen dramatically. And in a short time, it would have been flooded with German tourists going to the Greek islands, and its export strength would have grown. The reason they don't want anyone to exit because it'll expose the poverty of their system. So as progressives, really learn some economics, build up a case so that you can defend yourself against my profession, which is the most shameful profession there is. And work with progressives across Europe on exit plans. Thank you.